For the last few years on the channel, I've always wanted to do a video talking about every first round pick. Usually I'm stuck watching the draft with friends and I don't end up doing it, but this year I planned ahead, and in today's video, we are going to go through all 32 of this year's first round draft picks, and I'm going to give you a 30-second rundown on who they are. Before you get started, if you're new here and you love football, be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like if you want to support my work, and let me know your thoughts on this year's first round of the draft. I've also made a ton of full-length videos on some of the guys selected in today's draft, and I'll leave that in both the description and the comment section, so be sure to check out all those videos on your favorite prospect. Now, let's get started. Bryce Young is a household name. Coming out of California, he was a 5-star recruit and originally pledged to USC. After taking some time to think about it, he eventually flipped to Bama, where he became a backup to Mac Jones in 2020. In 2021, he'd take over as the starting quarterback, throwing for 4,872 yards with 47 touchdowns. He led the Crimson Tide to the national championship and won the Heisman Trophy along the way. In 2022, he put up 3,328 yards with 32 touchdowns, and his numbers were a little bit down, but part of that was due to injury and his offensive line not being as good. Young is definitely a franchise quarterback, and I'm really excited to see what he is going to do over the next few years. CJ Stroud has not always been seen as a future NFL draft pick. Coming out of California, for a while he was only listed as a 3-star player, but after blowing up at the Elite 11 camp, he became a 5-star talent and decided to go across the country to Ohio State. As a freshman in 2020, he would be the backup to Justin Fields before he would take over in 2021, beating 2 other guys out for it. He had a couple of great receivers like Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and Jaxson Smith-Njigba, and he threw for 4,435 yards with 44 touchdowns. Unfortunately, their season ended early with a loss to Michigan, and despite training for a year to get revenge, Stroud's numbers dropped a little bit in 2022. He threw for 3,688 yards and only 41 touchdowns, and once again lost to Michigan, this time at home. They still got to the college football playoff, and Stroud is definitely a franchise quarterback, but some are worried about his motor, and some are worried about a certain test he took. We'll have to see how he does. Will Anderson Jr. is going to be an NFL star. People knew this during his senior year, as he went from a random 4-star recruit to a 5-star player in just one season. He was at Dutchtown High School in Georgia, and Nick Saban found a way to pry him away from Kirby Smart. Bama fans knew immediately that Anderson was going to be a star, as a true freshman in 2020, he finished with 7 sacks and 52 tackles. He was a freshman All-American, and then put together one of the best seasons for a pass rusher in college football history in 2021. He had over 100 tackles, 3 pass deflections, and 17.5 sacks. No matter what you tried to do, you couldn't stop him. In 2022, he had pretty much an impossible bar to live up to, but he still managed to finish with 10 sacks and 51 tackles. He'll go down as one of the best pass rushers in Alabama history, if not the best, and is going to be a star in the NFL. Anthony Richardson has been one of the most polarizing prospects over the last few months. Coming out of Gainesville, Florida, he originally committed to Dan Mullen at Florida, but he'd be stuck behind Emory Jones his first 2 years there. In 2021, he'd show a glimpse of stardom, but in 2022, he finally took over as a starter. He ended up finishing with 2,549 yards and 17 touchdowns, with 9 more scores on the ground. He was inconsistent at best, didn't really win that many big games, and many believe is just a running back. Some scouts, though, think he's a generational talent, and we'll just have to wait and see how he does. Devon Witherspoon has one of the most insane stories in this year's draft. Coming out of Pensacola, Florida, he picked up football towards the end of his high school career, and after starring there, he got an offer to play at the JUCO level. At the last second, Illinois would give him a scholarship offer, and he arrived at Illinois and made noise on special teams immediately. In 2020, he played pretty decent before he had a breakout season in 2021. He had 52 tackles, 9 pass deflections, and 1 sack during that time. He could have declared him in a late-round pick, but he decided to bank on his potential and come back in 2022. This year, he finished with 42 tackles, 14 pass deflections, and 3 interceptions. He was an All-American and had insane numbers, despite teams not even throwing the ball to him. Witherspoon is probably the best corner in this year's draft, and I'm really excited to see how he's going to do over the next few years. Quentin Johnston has been seen as one of the top offensive linemen in football for quite some time. Coming out of Princeton High School in Cincinnati, Johnston was the #1 offensive tackle, a 5-star recruit, and the #9 player in the country. Johnston was expected to play right away when he got to college, and he ended up having a great career for the Buckeyes. He played in 31 games for 3 seasons and started 26 consecutive games in 2021 and 2022. He became a first-team All-American in 2022 and is one of those guys that's going to translate really well to the NFL and block for your quarterback for years to come. Wilson is a really interesting player. Coming out of Henderson, Texas, he'd finished his career with 249 tackles, 60 TFLs, and 11.5 sacks. He was one of the best players in the state of Texas and was a consensus 3-star recruit. He was part of Texas A&M's 2018 class, and after 2 years there, he transferred to Texas Tech. In 2020, he played a minimal role before he'd break out in 2021. He finished with 7 sacks, becoming one of the best pass rushers in the country, and then in 2022, he upped his numbers to 61 tackles, 1 forced fumble, and 7 sacks once again. At 6'6", he's seen as one of the most athletic players in the draft and could be one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. Bijan Robinson is the top running back in this year's draft. Coming out of Tucson, Arizona, Robinson had offers from every school in America and eventually decided to go over to Texas. In 2020, he would get a chance to start as a true freshman, finishing with 703 yards and 4 scores. In 2021, Robinson would have a historic start to the season, but he'd unfortunately get hurt. In those games, he ran for 1,127 yards with 11 touchdowns and was considered a Heisman candidate at times. In 2022, he built upon that as he finished with 1,580 yards and 18 touchdowns. Career, he averaged nearly 6.5 yards per carry, and Robinson is going to be a dynamic threat out of the backfield for years to come. Carter is one of the most interesting players from this year's draft class. As a senior at Apopka High School, he ended up finishing with 64 tackles, 38 solo tackles, and 12 sacks during his senior campaign. He ended up becoming a 5-star recruit and chose to go to the Georgia Bulldogs. As a freshman in 2020, he'd end up finishing with 14 tackles, and then he became an anchor on their defensive line in 2021. He finished with 37 tackles and 3 sacks, and was arguably the most disruptive player on the roster. In 2022, Carter returned, finishing with 32 tackles, 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and 3 pass deflections. Unfortunately, he got in some trouble off the field, and at times didn't look like he was in great shape, so while he is a bit controversial, Carter has a lot of potential and could be a star. Coming out of Huntington, West Virginia, Darnell Wright was one of the top players in high school football and a 5-star offensive lineman. He decided to spurn the home state school of West Virginia to go down south to play for Tennessee, and he was apparently a top 10 recruit. Wright had a ridiculous amount of hype when he arrived in Rocky Top, and he apparently saw 2,746 total snaps in 4 years there. He played in 47 games, making 42 starts, and ended up being an All-SEC first-team member, and won the SEC Offensive Lineman of the Week award twice. He's likely going to be your average starting lineman, and someone that could block for a long time. Peter Skoronski is one of the most underrated linemen in this year's draft, and he came out of the Illinois area. He was a top 150 recruit, and was seen as one of the top offensive linemen in the class of 2019. He became the 4th highest recruit in Northwestern history, and then became a true freshman All-American in 2020. He started all 12 games as a sophomore, then had a huge junior season, as he won the Remington Award, had the best single-season pass-blocking grade in PFF, and was a unanimous first-team All-American. He'll be a tremendous player for the Titans, and someone who has a really high ceiling. Coming out of Georgia, Jahmyr Gibbs was one of the top running back prospects in the class of 2020, and initially decided to commit to Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech. He stuck it out for a couple of years, where he had a tremendous first 2 seasons with the Yellow Jackets. After becoming one of the best all-purpose players and an All-American there, he decided to transfer to Alabama for his final season. Last year, he ran for 926 yards and 7 touchdowns, but also was a factor in the receiving game with 44 catches for 444 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's one of those players that can both run and catch out of the backfield and will be a great weapon for the Lions. Lukas Van Ness was a little-known recruit coming out of Illinois, as he was originally a hockey player and eventually decided to go to Iowa. He was somewhat of a freak athlete though, so if he could be properly developed, he could be a great pass rusher. He ended up not playing in 2020 before he would break out onto the scene in 2021, finishing with 7 sacks. If he could build upon that promising year, he could find himself as an NFL draft pick. This past season, he finished with 36 tackles and 6.5 sacks. While he didn't ever start a game for Iowa, he was a tremendous athlete and has recently blown up. He ultimately ended up becoming a top 15 pick, and he has a chance to be a great player with a really high ceiling. Lineman from this year's draft is Broderick Jones. Coming out of high school, Broderick was a 5-star recruit and was from Lithania, Georgia. Hopefully I said that right. Coming out of high school, he was seen as one of those superhuman-like players and one of those linemen that pretty much everybody wanted. He ended up redshirting in 2020 before he'd be named to the All-SEC freshman team in 2021. In 2022, he would start at left tackle in all 15 games, and at 6'4" and 310 pounds, Broderick will be blocking for your quarterback for quite some time. Will McDonald was one of the best kept secrets going into the 2023 NFL Draft, as coming out of high school, he was only a 3-star recruit. As a senior, he finished with 69 tackles and 11.5 sacks, and eventually went on to go to Iowa State. In 2018, he played a little bit, before he ended up having a breakout freshman season in 2019. He had 6.5 sacks, which was a freshman record, and he continued on dominating. He ended up having 10.5 sacks in 2020, 11.5 sacks in 2021, and then this past year he had 5. In retrospect, he probably shouldn't have came back for a 6th year, as one of the best Iowa State players ever, is a great pass rusher and a great athlete. I'm talking about Emmanuel Forbes since 2019. As a senior at Granada High School in Mississippi, he ended up finishing with 49 tackles and 8 interceptions. He also had 12 pass breakups, 31 catches, and 7 receiving touchdowns. He was a 4-star player and decided to commit to Mississippi State. In 2020, he finished with 44 tackles, 6 pass deflections, and 5 interceptions, becoming one of the best freshman corners in the country. In 2021, he'd end up having 59 tackles with a forced fumble, 3 picks, and a sack. And then in 2022, he had his best season yet, as he finished with 46 tackles, 11 pass deflections, and 6 interceptions. He also had 6 total pick sixes in his career, and Forbes is one of the best kept secrets in this year's draft class. Gonzales is another example of how to perfectly use the transfer portal. Coming out of Texas, he was a guy who played both offense and defense, as he was a superstar receiver and a lockdown corner. Because of this, 24/7 Sports listed him as a 4-star recruit, and instead of going to a big school, he decided to go to Colorado. In 2020, he'd end up starting a couple of games before he'd have a breakout season in 2021. With the Buffaloes, he finished with 53 tackles and 5 pass deflections. He decided to enter the portal, and he went over to Oregon. This past year, he started against some of the best receivers in the country, finishing with 51 tackles, 7 pass deflections, and 4 interceptions. Gonzales is arguably the top corner in this year's draft, and he is definitely a great weapon for this team. Jack Campbell is the definition of a smart and good linebacker, as coming out of Cedar Falls, Iowa, he was only a 3-star recruit, but he finished with 338 career tackles. As a senior, he had 168 of them, with 12.5 tackles for loss and 5 sacks. Campbell would end up playing 4 years for the Hawkeyes, progressively getting better each and every one. In 2020, he'd break out with 29 tackles and 3 pass deflections, and then in 2021, he'd have 140 tackles, 5 pass deflections, a sack, 2 interceptions, and a pick 6. He came back in 2022 and once again had 125 tackles with 2 interceptions and 1 pass deflection. He's a guy who's smart, knows how to read offenses, and is a great tackler. He'll be a great fit for the Lions. Calijah Cancey has seen a steady rise since his high school days, as when he played at Northwestern High School in Miami, he finished with 110 tackles as a senior. Because of that, he got high major interest and was a 3-star recruit and the number 64 defensive tackle in the class of 2019. Cancey would arrive at Pitt, and he started playing in 2020. 2021 would be his breakout season, as he finished with 33 tackles, 7 sacks, and a forced fumble, and then in 2022, he had another great year. He once again finished with 7 sacks and was named a unanimous All-American. First unanimous All-American since Aaron Donald. If he's anything like Aaron, then he's going to have a long and successful career. Jaxson Njigba has probably been the forgotten receiver prospect in this year's draft because he didn't play much last year. Going back in time, Njigba went to Rockball High School in Texas and finished with an insane 5,346 career receiving yards and 82 touchdowns. He became a 5-star recruit and went up to Ohio State. He didn't play a whole lot as a freshman, except he had a memorable 1-footed catch, and then in 2021 he would take over. Despite Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave being on the roster, Njigba would finish with 95 catches for 1,606 yards and 9 touchdowns. He became an All-American and was projected to be the top receiver in 2022. Except he dealt with an injury all season, limiting him to 5 catches for 43 yards. Scouts know he has great production and he'll translate well to the NFL, but the big key here is, will he be healthy and how will that injury affect him? Coming out of Texas, Quentin Johnston originally committed to Texas, but would later flip to TCU. When he got there, he'd make an immediate impact as he caught 22 passes for 487 yards and 2 touchdowns and had one of the best freshman campaigns for a TCU receiver ever. In 2021, he'd end up finishing with 33 catches for 600 yards and 6 touchdowns, but his season was cut short due to injury. In 2022, he'd put it all together, as along with TCU rising all the way to the national championship game, Johnston would catch 60 passes for 1,069 yards and 6 scores. While he hasn't had the greatest touchdown numbers, Johnston's a tall, athletic receiver who's a prototype to be a future star. Coming out of the Sunshine State, Flowers was an under-recruited player coming out of high school and eventually decided to commit to Boston College. This was a program not known for developing wide receiver talent, and Flowers would switch from a defensive back to a receiver pretty quickly. In 2019, he'd break out with 3 touchdowns before he'd become Phil Dracovich's top receiver in 2020. During that season, he had 892 yards and 9 scores, and then followed that up with 746 yards and 5 touchdowns in 2021. While Boston College wasn't great, Flowers was a star for them, and he even got multiple huge NIL offers. He decided to turn it down to stay with Boston College, and this past year, he had a career season, catching 78 passes for 1,077 yards and 12 touchdowns. He's the best statistical wide receiver in Boston College history, is a quick, good route runner who's pretty athletic, and will be a steal for the Ravens. Jordan Addison has been projected as a big-time receiver for a couple of years now, as coming out of high school in 2019, he caught 25 passes for 544 yards and 8 touchdowns. Because of that, he was a 4-star recruit and decided to go to Pitt. As a freshman in 2020, Addison would break out onto the scene, finishing with 60 catches for 666 yards and 4 touchdowns. Addison was expected to be even better in 2021, and alongside Kenny Pickett, he had an insane year. He finished with 100 catches for 1,593 yards and 17 touchdowns. He won the Blitnikoff Award and then shocked the world by transferring to USC. Last year with Caleb Williams, he finished with 59 receptions for 875 yards and 8 touchdowns, and is one of those receivers that could be in the NFL for a long time. One of the most random rising players in the 2023 NFL Draft was Deonte Banks. Coming out of Edgewood High School in Maryland, Banks decided to stay home and commit to the Terrapins. He was a 3-star recruit and the number 76 corner in the class of 2019, so he was definitely not really on the NFL's radar. He ended up having a good season in 2019 as a true freshman, finishing with 28 tackles, 2 pass deflections, and an interception. In his next 2 years, he didn't make much of an impact. 2022, though, he bounced back with 38 tackles, 8 pass deflections, and an interception. Banks is really athletic, has done a tremendous job in coverage, and is one of those late rising players that could be the steal of the draft or a bust. This year's tight end class is loaded, and Dalton Kincaid is arguably the best. Coming out of Southern California, he had no offers coming out of high school, so he had to walk on at San Diego. They're an FCS program, and after 2 great years there, Kyle Whittingham in Utah took a chance on him. He played sparingly in 2020 before he'd have a breakout season in 2021. He finished with 36 catches for 510 yards and 8 touchdowns, but decided to bypass the NFL for 1 more year. He ended up having a historical season as he led Utah with 70 receptions for 890 yards and 8 touchdowns, which included a historic performance with 16 catches and 2 touchdowns against USC. And right now, he is seen as one of the best pass catchers in this year's draft and could be a generational tight end prospect if he's developed properly. Mazi Smith is one of the more underrated draft prospects because there's some controversy around his name. Coming out of Michigan alongside 5-star tackle Logan Brown, but Mazi developed a great relationship with Michigan staff and decided to become a Wolverine. In 2020, he played very limited action before he became a starter in 2021. As an interior lineman, he had 37 tackles, 3 pass deflections, and 22 assisted tackles. This past year, he upped those numbers to 49 tackles, with 1 sack and 1 forced fumble. Mazi was one of the best interior linemen in all of college football, but he got caught with a firearm on a traffic stop, and for a while he was in some trouble, but it luckily all got cleared out, and he is all good now. He's going to be a great pick for the Cowboys, and someone I look forward to watching. Anton Harrison has been a big deal for quite some time. Coming out of Archbishop Carroll High School in Washington, D.C., Harrison was listed as a 4-star recruit and the number 17 offensive tackle in the class of 2020. He'd arrive at Oklahoma with a considerable amount of hype, and would end up playing in 9 games as a freshman. In 2021, he'd start 12 games, and then in 2022, he'd once again start every game. He was named a first-team All-Big 12 selection, and at 6'5" and 315 pounds, Harrison will be one of the top linemen in the NFL soon. Myles Murphy has been a big deal since the very beginning, as coming out of Hillgrove High School in Marietta, Georgia, his senior year, he had 53 tackles, 19 tackles for loss, and 10.5 sacks. He was a 5-star recruit and later decided to commit to Clemson. Murphy would get an opportunity to play in 2020, finishing with 38 tackles, 4 sacks, and 3 forced fumbles. He showed unique promise and traits that could dominate college football. He ended up finishing with 7 sacks in 2021. Before this year, he had his best season yet. He finished with 40 tackles, 2 pass deflections, 6.5 sacks, and 1 fumble, and he had a great 3-year career at Clemson, is one of those insane athletes, and is ready to be in the opposing team's backfield. We all knew Clemson had a pair of terrific defensive linemen, and Brian Bresee is now the second guy selected. Coming out of Maryland, Bresee was actually the #1 ranked recruit in the country, ahead of guys such as DJ Uyunglele and Bryce Young. Bresee would play as a true freshman in 2020, finishing with 23 tackles, 4 sacks, and 1 forced fumble. He'd be limited in 2021 to just 13 tackles and 1.5 sacks, and then in 2022, he finished with 15 tackles and 3.5 sacks. 1, he's an interior lineman. 2, their stats aren't as good. And 3, he struggled with tragedy. Unfortunately, his sister would pass away due to cancer, and this was an awful time and really tough on him. Bresee, though, is going to be a steal in the NFL, and will probably channel all of that anger into the football field and making a success for him and his family. Nolan Smith has been a household name for quite some time, as he was one of Kirby Smart's first commitments, and he chose the Bulldogs 2 years before he arrived. He ended up going to IMG Academy, where he dominated future NFL players. Smith would arrive at Georgia in 2019 and had a modest role his first 2 years on campus. In 2021, he would start to blow up, finishing with 55 tackles, 1 pass deflection, 3.5 sacks, and 3 forced fumbles. Except, he decided to come back for the 2022 season and put the NFL draft on hold. This year, he started out strong, but unfortunately got hurt midway through the year and would have to watch from the sidelines. He got to win 2 national championships while he was there, blew up at the combine, and is one of those freakishly athletic hybrid players that could terrorize your opponent's quarterback for years to come. The final pick in the 2023 NFL Draft's first round was Felix Anaduke-Uzomah. This guy's been hyped up for quite a while, but coming out of high school, he really wasn't much of a big deal. He played at Lee's Summit, and despite finishing for 184 tackles, 55 TFLs, and 13 sacks, he was only a low-rated recruit, and eventually went to Kansas State. He was one of 9 true freshmen to see the field in 2020, and then in 2021, he started to blow up. He finished with 52 tackles and 11 sacks, becoming one of the top defensive ends in the country. In 2022, he had a lot of hype and ended up delivering on it. He finished with 46 tackles, 8.5 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles. And while his name has been slipping over the last few weeks, Kansas City needed a little bit of help on the defensive line and drafted the hometown kid at the last pick. So yeah, tonight we went through all 31 draft picks. This video took forever to make, so be sure to leave a like, let me know your thoughts down below, and check out all my NFL draft videos, and there's going to be plenty more to come over the next couple days. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.